But they knew 200 years ago that lead and mercury had all sorts of problems, made you go insane. You know, they knew 100 years ago what fluoride did. I mean, that's the University of Texas studies and German studies from 80, 90, 100 years ago. So, I mean, here you are discovering that this really is increasing crime and antisocial behavior and a dumbing down. But now let's look at why they decided to put it in the water.
Well, first of all, I want to raise a question to you with what you just said. It's not so clear that fluoride itself is always the problem. I bet you know somebody who uses toothpaste with sodium fluoride in it.
Yes.
And there's, you have to have an awful lot of fluoride to cause a problem. I mean, obviously, if you have too much of anything, get above a certain level, it's really bad news.
But see, that's the thing, Professor. People don't know that the word fluoride is a coverall for dumping hundreds of things in the water. So maybe we should get to that and then break down the history of it. But go ahead.
All right. Well, look, the main thing is that in putting fluoride in the water, instead of sodium fluoride, most of it, over 90% of it, uses one of two chemicals, either something called fluorosilicic acid, which has got 2 atoms of hydrogen, a silicon, and 6 atoms of fluoride, or sodium silicofluoride, which is 2 atoms of sodium, a silicon, and 6 fluorides. That's a more complicated compound than sodium fluoride, which is 1 sodium, 1 fluoride. And the sodium fluoride was first tested. It was tested for safety. You put that in the water, the fluoride and the fluorine and the sodium atoms separate. If the fluorine sticks to your teeth, the evidence was at the time that it toughens the surface of your teeth, so it cuts down, supposed to cut down cavities. Now, the whole problem with these other chemicals, generally called silicofluorides, is that they have this other chunk to them, the 2 hydrogens, the silicon, and actually 1 or 2 fluorides. It's a chemist I work with. Everything in this is done with a chemist named Roger Copeland. I really owe him a great deal because he's the one who got me started on looking at fluoride compounds. He calls it an oligomer of silicic acid, which is a fancy word for just saying there's a chemical there that's left over after you put these silicofluorides into the water. And so the real question is, why do we put them in the water? And so I'm going to ask you a question. What agency of the federal government do you think decided to design the idea and got people to start putting a fluoride compound, not fluoride, it's a fluoride compound, in water supply?
The Department of Energy, after they had, had all these millions of tons of toxic waste piled up, and they had some spills in Tennessee and other places that killed some of the rivers.
Actually, it was before that.
Well, I know that it was Department of Energy that went around to all the cities and lobbied everybody, but I mean, go ahead, give us the history, Professor.
The history goes back to World War II. And
yeah, the Manhattan Project, but I'm saying after...
But it goes back before that, because...
Okay. Well, tell us the whole history then. That's why we've got you here. You're the expert on this.
Well, the history begins, actually, with Einstein coming to the United States and writing that letter to Roosevelt about the possibility of making this bomb that would make a huge explosion. Einstein wrote Roosevelt a letter about the possibility of having a nuclear bomb. Then the Germans took over Czechoslovakia, called the Anschluss. That was one of the things that triggered World War II. But when the Nazis went into Czechoslovakia, why did they pick that place? They occupied the place with the best uranium in Europe. Now, one thing we forget is that when Einstein came to the United States as a brilliant physicist, there are other brilliant physicists who stayed in Germany.
Like Max Planck.
Yeah, and Hitler began a nuclear weapons project. Now, in fact, we know 2 things about that that's worth mentioning, because I want the audience to have in mind that this is all secret during World War II. This question of whether Hitler had the bomb, whether we didn't want anybody to know we were working on a bomb.
Well, he really did. We only had enough to test one. At the end of the near the end of the war, they did that secret deal. I'm sure you know about this, Professor, with the U-boat trading in exchange for safety in South America.
But, sure, but the question is, first of all, what is not generally known is that there's a question of why Hitler didn't make more progress with the great physicist, and there's a rumor. It's never been proved. We have no evidence for it. It's a guess that some nuclear physicist, and perhaps the great physicist Heisenberg, arranged for the experiments to fail because they didn't want Hitler to have them. Well, the one thing we do know is that Hitler had a huge supply of uranium that he had separated. You have to separate uranium from other elements in rock. It's a little difficult to enrich it. You know, all this stuff we hear about these centrifuges now. You have to do something to make the uranium into a state where it can cause a bomb. And Hitler put his uranium in a place in Norway called Peenemund, where he put the uranium in something called heavy water, which absorbs radiation so it couldn't explode. They weren't sure what to do with their uranium so it wouldn't have an accident, and they didn't want it to be in Germany because they were afraid we'd bomb it, so they put it in Norway.
And so they sent in U.S. forces that followed it when it went across the lake on the barge and sunk it.
That's right. So we destroyed his uranium, and that set that whole thing way back. Hitler himself was apparently not as there are some reports. He wasn't as interested in that as some of the scientists anyway. So we were lucky, I suppose, on that score. But
well, have you seen the German maps on what their A-bomb was going to do to Manhattan? But it was so late in the war, they decided the U.S. would annihilate them with conventional weapons, so they made a deal. Roger Masters is our guest. A lot of his material is published online. He's a top academic and professor at Dartmouth School of Government, Department of Government, with an Nelson A. Rockefeller Professor of Government chair, basically. And he was under the head honcho of the neocons, Leo Strauss. Before he leaves us, I'll get him to diverge and get a little bit into that. But he got into researching what is fluoride, what are the different types of fluoride, why is it being put in the water. We now have all these studies from all over the world, what it does, and boy, it is not pretty. But he doesn't even want to get into that issue. He just wants to get into why it was put there. And so, but please continue. You've gotten up to the German atomic program.
I want to get through why it was put there and focus on what it does. I want to spend most of this time on what it does. I want to explain, though, that the start of putting any fluoride in water was super secret because the Manhattan Project had a problem in the 1940s. They didn't want anybody to know how far advanced we were in making a bomb. And we only had very poor level of a supply of uranium in the United States. It's in rocks, in any kind of granite rocks that you have to break down and grind up and then put an acid in to separate the various elements. And so it's a little bit complicated to get the uranium out compared to what Hitler had in Czechoslovakia. And the consequence of that is that you had a waste product that was a very powerful acid. And the scientist who was responsible for the machinery to separate out that toxic acid from the sludge, a man named Byron Copeland, chemical engineer, brilliant chemical engineer. When he heard that I was doing work on how lead and manganese caused crime or is associated with crime, he got in touch and said, "Do I know anything about silicofluorides?" I said, "I didn't know anything. I'd never even heard of them." And so I did all the work with him. This is all a research project that comes from somebody else telling me, oh, I wasn't paying attention to something important. And he knew about that because he was a chemical engineer involved in the whole process. And so everything I say is the result of what two people have done. That is, I've been working with somebody else, and I should tell you one thing. Mike is a kind of scientist who isn't afraid of saying, we're on a phone call like this, and he'll say, hey, Roger, shut up and listen to me, because I've made a mistake in chemistry, and I make mistakes in chemistry, I rely on him. Science is about being able to engage in a discussion And so you should stop me anytime when I get into the facts of the case that I've discovered and say, well, what do I mean, or why about what, and so forth. Still, the big thing is that because putting fluoride in water had to be secret, so people in Germany or Japan didn't know how much uranium we were processing, everybody talked about putting fluoride in water. And the Manhattan Project started by putting putting sodium fluoride, which is the simple thing we have in toothpaste, in a couple of places. They compared 2 towns in New York, and there was no problem. And once they got it approved, they switched. And then they could dump fluosilicic acid into a water supply because they were assuming that it would dissolve or dissociate into its elements. And since they assumed, literally, the approval was based on an assumption